When I was 11 years old, I stole some basketball cards from a friend and neighbor of mine. I remember distinctly the age because it was 1996 during the Summer Olympics that were held here in Atlanta. And they were cards of members of the U.S. men's Olympic basketball team, the Dream Team 2 team. Not as famous or as good as the original Dream Team, but they had my favorite player, Shaquille O'Neal. And so I stole his card and Alonzo Mourning and Reggie Miller from my friend and neighbor. And this week, I did something weird. I like a sermon that gets me to do something weird. I sent a Facebook friend request to that former neighbor of mine, that friend of mine from childhood, and he accepted, and I sent him a Facebook message to apologize and to ask if he wanted the cards back. It was really, really anguishing to sit down and write that and to feel the nervousness and the guilt and the fear of sending the request and writing the message and wondering, is he going to be angry? Is he going to feel like this is just doing more harm than good? What am I going to do if he actually wants the cards back? Because I don't know where they are now. I want to talk this morning about slavery reparations and what this small instance brought to mind for me was the difficulty and the complexity and very possibly the impossibility of having a conversation about and having slavery reparations in our country. Because trying to extrapolate how emotionally taxing it was for me to sit there and send that request and that message, trying to extrapolate that out to what it would mean for an entire group of people to go through that process collectively, ask for forgiveness from another group of people, for that group then to do their own processing around a response, and for that only to be the beginning of a dialogue. How might we ever get there is at best an extremely challenging question to ask and to encounter. But this week being the anniversary of Juneteenth, of the emancipation of the slaves in the state of Texas, and by extension, for the sake of this holiday, the emancipation of slaves throughout the United States, I think is an important moment to stop and ask how we can continue to do the work of creating a just and equitable society. That was an important moment, a celebratory moment, a joyous moment to know that now, since then, 150 years, no one has been able to own another human being in the United States. That emancipation for African Americans was a huge step in our journey towards freedom. But to not forget that we are still very much taking that journey, that we must continue to ask ourselves really difficult questions about what we can do to continue that journey. So considering slavery reparations as an opportunity for European Americans to begin to acknowledge and repair the damage caused by slavery, by a system from which we have benefited. An opportunity for African Americans to be paid back for the vast amounts of unpaid labor they put into building wealth, of which they never received any. It's an opportunity, and it is a complex question. The complexity was brought home to me as I was doing my research and came across an article by Henry Louis Gates Jr. Many of you may remember him from the news back in 2011 when he was arrested for trying to get into his own home in Cambridge, Massachusetts. He wrote an article. He's an African-American scholar at Harvard. He wrote an article in 2010. There was an op-ed for the New York Times addressing one of the many really complex and difficult aspects of slavery reparations. He wrote about the complicity of Africans in the slave trade. And what do we do about that? He said that the slave trade on the scale that we know it would not have been possible without cooperation between African elites and European slave traders. He lists the Akan, the Fon, the Mbundu, and Congo kingdoms in Africa as having benefited, having grown wealthy from the slave trade, from having captured and enslaved and sold their fellow Africans, who then many of them became African Americans and slaves. He tells the story of the president of Benin a few years ago going to a church in Baltimore of African Americans and asking for their forgiveness, saying that his country had benefited from selling slaves to European traders, the slaves who then came to America were the African Americans, were the ancestors of the people in this congregation. He acknowledged that his own country had had a role in that, and he asked for their forgiveness. It had not occurred to me at all when I started thinking about slavery reparations that there would be implications for countries in Africa if we really ask what reparations in their entirety mean. Complex questions. And once we open the door to reparations for African Americans, we will, by necessity, begin asking questions about reparations for many groups in many forms. The First Nations peoples of the Americas, who occupied the lands of our continent before any Europeans came. For the Latinos and the Asian Americans who have been exploited and oppressed for the economic gain of the wealthy in our nation. So many questions that will be generated in this process, and so much power that this process will generate to be able to ask those questions, to be able to begin those conversations and those dialogues, and to uproot the racist foundations that our nation has. The most comprehensive and compelling argument in favor of slavery reparations contemporarily comes from Ta-Nehisi Coates in The Atlantic. I suspect many of you have read that piece from last year. If you haven't, please take time to read it this week. It's long, but it's very well worth it. Just Google The Atlantic, slavery reparations, and long but worthwhile piece. And he begins with 3 quotations in that piece from Deuteronomy, from John Locke's second treatise, and from the lived experience of a slave in 1861. All sources that feed into our tradition that we should respect and pay attention to. And I want to highlight in particular the quote from John Locke's second treatise. It is this: "Besides the crime which consists in violating the law and varying from the right rule of reason, whereby a man so far becomes degenerate and declares himself to quit the principles of human nature and to be a noxious creature, there is commonly injury done to some person or other, and some other man receives damage by his transgression. In which case, he who hath received any damage has, besides the right of punishment common to him with other men, a particular right to seek reparation." This is coming from John Locke, the rationalist Enlightenment father of our Unitarian forebears, who took rationalism and extended it to transcendentalism, our great gift to the world theologies. John Locke is saying that there is a type of crime, the committing of which makes the person who commits it to be a noxious creature, a degenerate. It violates the right rule of reason. Slavery, slave ownership very much falls into this category. And he's saying when a crime of that category is committed, the person offended by it has not only the right to the punishment of the offender that all people have, but also the right to reparations. Coates uses two particular striking examples since 1865 that I want to highlight to talk about the continuing damage of slavery and of racism to African Americans in our country. Two of course, many methods of oppression, continuing oppression. He writes about the Jim Crow era violence in this country, the segregation and the separation that allowed for the continuation of white supremacy and of the legacy of slavery in many ways unabated in the years after that through racist violence, lynchings, separation, segregation, many ways of being able to have that racist legacy that our nation was founded on and depended on in so many ways continue for years. And in the 20th century, we cannot ignore the practice of redlining. I want to quote directly from Coates regarding how redlining looked in Chicago, the example that he prominently uses. He says, "Today, Chicago is one of the most segregated cities in the country, a fact that reflects assiduous planning. In the effort to uphold white supremacists at every level down to the neighborhood, Chicago has long been a pioneer. The efforts began in earnest in 1917 when the Chicago Real Estate Board, horrified by the influx of Southern blacks, lobbied to zone the entire city by race. It was the Homeowners Loan Corporation, not a private trade association, that pioneered the practice of redlining, that is, selectively granting loans and insisting that any property it insured be covered by a restrictive covenant. A restrictive covenant being a clause in the deed forbidding the sale of the property to anyone other than whites. Millions of dollars because of this policy flowed from tax coffers into segregated white neighborhoods. Redlining persisted for over 50 years, was not outlawed officially until 1968 by the Fair Housing Act, but the damage was done and reports of redlining by banks have continued. There are so many forms in which oppression and exploitation have continued in our country since 1865, and it is so important for us to celebrate and to be thankful for the emancipation of slaves, but to also never forget the many ways in which our communities are still shaped by racist practices, by the legacies of the Jim Crow era South, and by redlining not only in Chicago, but here in Atlanta. Mike, can you show the redlining in Atlanta map? We know that this is something that happens, it has happened here in Atlanta because there are maps in the National Archives from the Federal Housing Authority of how Atlanta was redlined, how zones of the city were delineated from best down to hazardous based on how many African Americans or, quote, ethnic undesirables lived in those areas or were thought to be possibly moving there. Thank you, Mike. The bottom line for Coates and for me in thinking about whether I support slavery reparations and deciding to support slavery reparations comes down to this. Quote, "Perhaps no statistic better illustrates the enduring legacy of our country's shameful history of treating black people as sub-citizens, sub-Americans, and subhumans than the wealth gap. Reparations would seek to close this chasm, but as surely as the creation of the wealth gap required the cooperation of every aspect of society, bringing it will require the same. Bridging it will require the same. Perhaps after a serious discussion and debate, we may find that the country can never fully repay African Americans. But we stand to discover much about ourselves in such a discussion, and that is perhaps what scares us. The idea of reparations is frightening, not simply because we might lack the ability to pay. The idea of reparations threatens something much deeper: America's history, heritage, and standing in the world. This is a threatening idea to the very foundations, the very racist foundations of America. And it is that threat that lets us know that there is power in it to reshape those foundations of our country and to rebuild one that genuinely reflects who we are as a people and not our racist, oppressive, exploitative legacies. We're called to ask where in this foundation, where in this remaking we are, and to remember that we're not only talking about a legacy of slavery, of Jim Crow violence, of redlining, but also of racist violence happening in our country this week, in our region this week, that we know that this work is important because people are still dying because of the color of their skin. Many of us ask this week, why are we still living with terrorist violence against African Americans? In the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus asks, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Echoing the call of Psalm 22, "Why are you so far from saving me, so far from my cries of anguish?" Why indeed? Many of us held ourselves, held our heads, our neighbors, our friends, our families, our faith communities this week, and we asked, why? In my conception, God is all that is and all that is becoming the universe in its entirety, and thereby God joins us in our suffering, in our sorrow, in our grief, that when we grieve collectively, God is that interconnectedness, is that which connects us and thereby feels that many times over the sorrow and the grieving that comes along with the tragedy of terrorist murders in our region. So when we ask why, when we ask ourselves and each other, our families, our communities, when we ask God why, when we wail and weep and cry that why, in many ways, that wailing and weeping and sorrow is an answer in and of itself, that we are experiencing God's pain. God is experiencing our pain because we have not yet ended racist violence in our country and in our region. It's still happening, and we are still called to do the work of building a world where it doesn't happen anymore. We can't do that work alone, and that's why we are called into community, into religious community, anew each week, and called to remind ourselves that amidst this despair, we have power. We know that we have the power for social change because our heritage and our history tells us that Unitarians and Universalists and Unitarian Universalists have stood up time and time again throughout our history to the needed social change and won. That we have looked at education and prison reform and marriage equality at times when the status quo was accepted, seen as unchanging, immutable, and within a matter of decades, completely remade in the vision that we held up for it. And we have the opportunity as a community and as a faith movement to do similar work in anti-racism, to commit ourselves and to recommit ourselves to creating an anti-racist community, an anti-racist city and region and world. We know that we have the power for social change, and we know that this is something that we can commit ourselves to and make a difference on as a movement, as individuals, as a congregation. We feel the power of this moment. We feel the power of reimagining the foundations of our country and taking it from being one that is built on racist violence to one that genuinely is a just and equitable society. I heard back from my friend after I sent that Facebook message, and he had laughed off the idea that I should send him the cards. And I felt a lot better for having sent the message and for having asked him that. And I also found out that he is struggling with addiction in his life right now, that he's become alienated from his family because of it, and I offered any support that might be helpful. Gave him my cell phone number if I can ever be someone that he needs to talk to, affirmed his participation in Narcotics Anonymous. And I don't know if that's a connection that will be helpful to him in his journey towards recovery, but it's a possibility that was not there before I reached out, before I took the incredibly super uncomfortable in so many ways step of reaching out. And I don't know what is possible for us in the realm of anti-racist action and advocating a call for slavery reparations, but I know that the connections that will make it possible are not there unless we take the risks, unless we, in the words of Martin Luther King, substitute courage for caution and reach out in that way. We have a basis for making the connection now, my friend and I, that might be able to transform that relationship in his life. And that was optional. I'm glad that we have it. Having that basis racially in our country is not optional. It is quite literally a life or death question. As a minister, a person of conscience, someone aware of our country's history and devastated by its ongoing crisis of racial oppressions, I support slavery reparations. I hope that you will join me because I love you and I cannot do this work alone. Peace, salam, shalom. May it be so.